All right, we are continuing our study of parenting. As we were out because of our meeting last week, that is, the class did not continue last week, but today we're talking about raising teenagers. And if you're following in the workbook, we're on page 48. We are ready for lesson 10, which is lesson 8 in the workbook, because we split one lesson and we added a lesson at the beginning, so that's the reason for the sequence being a little different. But this is our 10th in the series, so you can kind of get a feel of what we've covered and where we're headed. And we will finish the workbook before we finish this study. So we'll add 2 studies at the end that are not in the workbook, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We have a rule that we mention each time, a parenting rule, that hopefully is helpful to parents. Some of these rules apply to the baby's age, some to teenage age, some in the middle, and some all the way across. So here's a rule that will fit with our study today, and we'll see this slide a little bit later in our study. This rule simply states to praise and commend your child at all ages to build self-confidence. The reason for that is that constant criticism that's done with the purpose of challenging the child to do better can destroy the child's confidence and can destroy their respect for you. Agree with that? Up and down, yes. Back and forth, no. That's the one principle we have a hard time. Agree? Good principle? I think so. I happen to have been privileged to be raised by parents who believed in that principle. As I started preaching, I recognize now, looking back, my efforts were feeble, that my style was not great, my English may not have been good, my organization may not have been there, and so those were feeble efforts at preaching. And yet my parents, while my dad would correct me on things and point out things I needed to improve in, they did a great deal of commending. You did good. Yeah, that was great. And that encouraged and gave me confidence. Had they been the kind of parents that zeroed in on how I could have done better, how I failed, how that was not good, I probably wouldn't be standing before you today. And perhaps you had parents much the same. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. Let's look on page 48. That should say 48. Why that says 41, I'm not sure. But let's talk about some introductory things to raising teenagers. Now, you may be at the point that your children are young and you say, I don't have teenagers. There's going to be some information here that you need to know because you will have teenagers at some point. Or if you already have teenagers, there'll be some things that will be helpful to us, hopefully. The teenage years have their own blessings and their own challenges. When our children were young, before they reached the teenage years, as the introduction, if you've read, suggests, we had parents telling us, parents who had already been through the teenage years with their children, paint a bleak picture of horror of the teenage years. Just enjoy these years because what you have ahead of you when you come to the teenage years is just going to be horrific. And perhaps they had experienced that. And yet we found that was not the case at all. As I suggest in the workbook at the time I was writing this, my children were 18 and 14, so that's a few years back when this lesson was submitted for this workbook. And yet those were years that we enjoyed just as much as we did when they were 3, 4, and 5. And as they were older as well. And perhaps you've experienced much the same thing. And so they don't have to be years of horror. They don't have to be years of a dark, bleak section in your life where you wished your children were younger. It should be a time when you recognize, you know what, my children have reached the teenage years and I'm enjoying this just as much as I did when they were small. And so don't wish your child to always be that little bitty infant or that toddler. There are challenges, to be sure, but we list in the workbook some blessings of the teenage years that you don't experience If, and this is impossible, but let's just suppose for illustration, you could freeze your child at the age you like, and you get them up to 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6, 7, whatever age you say, this is the age I really like, I'm going to freeze them at that, and this is what they're going to be. You're going to miss out on some things of the teenage years. And here's some of the blessings of the teenage years. Number one, to see your children obey the gospel. There's no greater joy, John said, than to see that your children walk in truth. 3 John and in verse 4. There's no greater joy than to see your child obey the gospel, to come from the waters of baptism and now know that they are now a child of God. You'll miss out on that if you don't have those teenage years. You're going to miss out on watching them develop their independence. Now, they may be independent at 4, wanting to do it themselves, but not in the same sense as when they're teenagers, when they begin to make decisions on their own and make wrong decisions and right decisions. And you get to see that in the teenage years. Here's something else. You're going to be able to witness their stand against the pressures of being teens and other teens that put peer pressure upon them. See, it's quite easy at the age of 5 or age 6 or 7. No, you're not going to do that, and that's the end of that story. But that's a little harder when they're 16, 17, 18 years old. And to see them take a stand on their own against the pressures, what a blessing that is. Here's another blessing. They get to prove that they really do fear God. You see, you make them go to Bible class when they're younger, and they can repeat back to you what you teach them, but it's in the teenage years where you begin to realize this is real for them. They do fear God. It took hold. It worked. All those pains, all those pressures, all those frustrations we had prior to this point have worked. It's paid off. And then finally, these may be the years that they'll start falling in love and find the one that they'll marry, and you say, oh man, I don't want that. And yes, that's a difficult time if you haven't reached that point with your children to watch them marry and leave home. But that's exactly what you want them to be able to do. You want them to have the happy home that you yourself have enjoyed. So there are blessings for those days. Does that make sense? All right, now get ready to answer, up or down, yes or do you agree with that? All right, we're getting the hang of it here. All right. All right, here's what we're going to cover in this lesson. 5 things. We're going to try to make it through those 5. And we're going to start with some general principles, preparing for the teen years and the challenges of the teen years and some examples. And if we have to skip point 4, I want to get to point 5 before we get through. Let's talk about some general principles that apply to all ages. And so you say, I don't have teens yet, but I have a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, or whatever it is that you have. And you say, how does this fit? Well, here's some general principles on page 48 now, if you care to follow there, about raising children. So let's develop these. Proverbs 22:6, what general principle do we see? All right, train them when they're little and they'll go that way when they're older. Proverbs 22:6, train a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he'll not depart from it. All right, here's some things that you'll see these listed, though not bullet pointed, at that very bottom of page 48 in the first column. You'll see these very points develop there. We need to teach children good behavior. So we're starting at the young age trying to tell them, no, you don't do that. You don't talk back to mama. You don't talk back to daddy. You do what mom and daddy say. You obey. And so you're teaching them those basic principles of behavior. That's involved in 22:6 of Proverbs. But also this passage talks about teaching them the way of God. So as they get older, we may start with some basic Bible stories, but as they develop older, we're developing some instruction about the way of God. Here's how God wants you to live. Here's what God wants you to do. Here's how God wants you to behave. So this passage tells us you start when they're young, and that's going to impact them when they're old. So what kind of teenager do you want? You say, well, I like the one that respects me, is obedient, that is the ideal teenager that goes to church on their own faith, et cetera, et cetera. You better get started now. Better get started now. Because what you do at age 2, age 1, et cetera, has a lot to do with the kind of teenager they will be. Agree with that? Yeah, that's what Proverbs 22:6 says. So you need to be thinking about what kind of child you want to be as an adult, them to be in that as an adult or as a teenager in this case, and then start working in that direction. So you don't wait till they're teenagers and now they're 14, 15 years old and say, well, here's what I'd like this teenager to be. You start much younger working toward that. Make sense? All right, point 2, top of page 48, second column. Bring the child up in the training and admonition of the Lord, Ephesians 6. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 6. Look at verse 4. Someone read verse 4 for us. All right, bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Do not provoke them to wrath. Now, the English Standard renders that the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bring them up in the discipline of the Lord. Bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. Now, this word translated training or discipline in the English Standard is the same word that's translated chastening in Hebrews 12. That's not talking about discipline of children, chastening a child, though it is a child's discipline is used as an illustration in Hebrews 12. It's talking in that context about persecution. But he illustrates that God chastens his children just like a father chastens his child. It is also the word translated instruction. The word of God is profitable doctrine and instruction in righteousness. That word instruction, same word that we find here in our text in Ephesians 6. The word admonition is the same word found in Titus chapter 3 and in verse 10, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. At least in the New King James, it's only translated with the word admonition. So, here's a couple of quotes. These, if you haven't read the workbook, these are quoted. Matthew Henry is quoted right there in the workbook if you want this quotation. And I like what Matthew Henry said. If you're familiar with Henry, Henry kind of sermonizes in his commentaries, and that he does here. It says, bring them up well in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, in the discipline of the proper and compassionate correction, and in the knowledge and the duty which the Lord requires of them, by which they may become better acquainted with Him. In other words, train your children so they become more and more acquainted with the Lord. Good point. He goes on to say, give them good education. It is a great duty of parents to be careful in the education of their children. Not only bring them up as the brutes do, raise your children, brutes do that, taking care to provide for them, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition in such a manner as is suitable to their reasonable nature. Nay, not only bring them up as men in nurture and admonition, but as Christians in the admonition of the Lord. Let them have the religious education. Instruct them to fearing sin and inform them of and excite them to the whole of their duties toward God. I like what Matthew Henry said there. Train a child. Teach them what they need to be taught. Teach them religion. Teach them to fear sin. In other words, he describes a progressive kind of development. Make sense? All right. I won't read all of this quotation. Adam Clarke made similar points concerning the discipline and instruction of the Lord, that nourish them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord and mind them to be nourished in the wholesome discipline and instruction as body is proper for food. He talks about these two words here, that the first word has to do with discipline and the second has to do with instruction that's necessary to form the mind, etc. You can read the rest of that quotation on your own. Both Adam Clarke and Matthew Henry give I think, the general concept of that. Anything else to add to this nurture and admonition of the Lord before we go to point C? All right, let's go to Deuteronomy 6. This ought to be a familiar passage to us. You need to familiarize yourself with Deuteronomy 6. Particularly if you're raising children, we need to diligently teach our children. Diligently teach our children, Deuteronomy 6. Now, I want you to notice verse 6. This is the second sermon that Moses is preaching in that 30-day period before they embark on the conquest. And he's trying to instill in the people, if we're going to go in the conquest and go into this land, we've got to be dedicated to God, and we've got to train our children to be dedicated to God. And so here's his point. Look at verse 6. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Speaking to parents, be in your heart. So the first point is, saturate yourself with the Word. What does that mean? They're part of who you are, absolutely. You can't bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord if you're not heeding that yourself and if you don't know that yourself. In other words, you can't send your children off to Sunday school and you don't have a clue. You don't know the difference in Hezekiah and Paul. You don't know the difference. You don't know where they fit. You don't know a theme. But you want your children to learn that. They're not going to learn it. They're not going to learn it. Make sense? So saturate your heart with the Word. Now then, verses 7 to 9, teach them diligently to your children. That word diligently is an interesting word that carries with it the idea of pressing it into your children as with a sharp instrument. Now, see, that sounds kind of odd. Someone said, I don't want to force anything on my children. The word literally means to press it into them, and it's the same word for which we get our word wet, as in sharpening. And so it has to do with as if with a sharp instrument you press it into your children. So you press the word into your children. Now I want you to look at verse 9. Verse 7, I'm sorry. You talk of them when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. What does that mean? Yeah. When you notice the wording of that, good point. That you do it when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now you're going to be teaching your children the word. You already know it. It's in your heart, and you're trying to teach it to your children. But you're going to talk of it when you lie down, and when you rise up, and when you walk by the way. In other words, you're going to look and use daily opportunities for application. In other words, I'm going to teach them this principle: we treat others the way we want to be treated. This is the golden rule. And then it may be that when you're in daily activity, maybe at the ball game, or maybe it's at the store, or maybe it's at a family gathering. Now, wait a minute. This is where we make application of that principle. This is why we acted that way, because of that Bible principle. Does that make sense? Yeah, riding in the car would be a good place to make that application. All right. Let's go to Deuteronomy 4 and in verse 10. Here's another principle of teach children to fear God. Now, this is in that first sermon of Moses, and he talks about gather people together, and I will let them hear my word, that they may learn to fear me all the days of their life, and they may teach their children. Notice, if you fear God, you've learned to fear God. And then you take that fear and you teach that fear of God to your children. So here's what I'm learning from that. Fear involves being afraid of displeasing God. I'm not going to take the time to develop those passages. But fear has to do with being afraid of displeasing God. I'm afraid I'm afraid to tell a lie because I'm afraid I'll lose my soul. Fear also involves standing in awe of God. As Jonah in 1 in verse 9, I fear God who made the sea and the dry land, he said. So what am I learning from that? That if our children fear God, it will be because we taught them to fear God. Your children aren't going to just happen to fear God. They're not going to soak it up somehow and they're just going to pull it out of the sky. That doesn't work that way. You want your child as a teenager to fear God. Get started early teaching them to fear God. Teaching them to stand in awe of God and be afraid of displeasing God. Start early. Does that make sense? Want a great teenager? Start early, teaching them the fear of God. All right? Children need restraint. What do we learn from 1 Samuel 2 and comparison with 1 Samuel 3? 1 Samuel 2 talks about a Bible character. His name was, starts with an E, Eli. Eli's sons were corrupt. The text says. Eli's sons were corrupt. Why were they corrupt? He didn't restrain them. Chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. So Eli's children were corrupt and he didn't restrain them. And once they become corrupt, he didn't restrain them. So there was a lack of restraint. Much like we saw recently in a sermon as we dealt with Aaron. Remember when they built the calf? Aaron didn't do something he should have done. Should have restrained them. He should have said, this is wrong. We can't do this. But he didn't restrain them. So they kept on. And he became party to that. So here's a basic principle. children that are not given restraint will become corrupt. What kind of teenager do you want? So I want one that's not corrupt. Get started early with restraint. With restraint. You've heard me tell this before. There was a family in the church where, when our children were young in Kentucky, that several in the congregation kind of ridiculed. They have such strict rules about their children. They don't let them do this and they don't let them do that, and they're pretty strict about their behavior and service, and this kind of ridiculed them. And what was interesting to me was those that were ridiculing them, their children had already grown and had already left the Lord. They were ridiculing somebody being strict when they themselves were not as strict as they should have been. Their children go astray, but these children to this day remain faithful. That's interesting to me. You want your children to be what they should be, then get involved in some restrictive discipline. All right, let's talk about preparing for the teen years. We're on page 49. Let's go to Proverbs 19:18. Let's list some things here. We're at the bottom of page 49, first column. We make the point that you cannot wait till they're teens and then decide, I want to get things under control. This starts many years before. So you need to get the behavior under control early. What does Proverbs 19:18 say? What does that mean? While there is hope. Absolutely. You have a child, you have a few short years to get their behavior under control, and if you wait till they're older and you still don't have it under control, it's probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen. I have sat with parents whose children have gone astray, who I thought were loose in their dealing with their children prior to that point, and now they're teenagers, maybe high school, maybe college age, and they're wondering what they can do. And it's sad for me to have to tell them, there's really nothing you can do. Not now. It's too late. That's sad. Don't be that kind of parent. So get the behavior under control early. So if you've got this 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old that is just being defiant, you don't get that under control, you're going to have a defiant teenager, and you haven't seen trouble till you have that defiant teenager. Make sense? All right?
John,
Yes, ma'am.
the rest of that verse says, do not set your heart on putting to death. Back then, a rebellious child was put to death. And this is saying, it's your fault. It's your choice.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. All right, let's go to Ephesians 6 now. Teach your children respect. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Teach them to respect others. What would that involve? Yeah. Show a little respect for those who are older. To get up and let an older person sit down. That makes sense? Teach your child when company comes in and the people are 3 times their age, get up and let that older person have a seat. That's showing respect. Teach them to say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Or call someone that's their grandparents' age Mr. or Mrs. And show them to have a little respect. That starts with them being taught to respect you as a parent. And to respect their teachers, to respect whoever else, people at church, etc. Does that make sense? Teach your children respect, all right? And so you want a respectful teenager that is not going to embarrass you, then start in those younger years training them to have respect for others. There's something else we need to do. Don't teach or allow things that you must correct or change later. What do we mean by that? Part of training a child in the way they should go, that's the passage we cite.
I think like when they're little, it might be funny for them to do something that's contrary to God's word. Not only God's word, but in society, where the people around might even think, oh, that's funny now. It's not funny when they're 13 or 14 and
Absolutely.
And they tell you something straight to your face, like in a restaurant or something.
Good.
No, I'm not gonna do that, or I'm not gonna do this, or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's cute at age 5 may not be so cute at 15, may be a real problem. Have you ever seen that little child that thinks they're really something and is kind of seems almost arrogant at age 5, and you kind of laugh, boy, he thinks he's hot stuff. Well, at 15, when he thinks he's hot stuff, it doesn't come across too well. Same principle of what may be cute again at 5 may be hard to overcome when the child sees some inconsistency. You tolerated it for years, and now suddenly you tell me it's wrong.
Well, they're growing up to be an adult, Donnie. And if that's the case, when they become an adult, it's going to be a big problem.
Absolutely. All right, here's another thing. Remember that little children grow up. Now, what's the point here? Everybody knows children grow up. Don't we? Or do we? All right, that's true. What'd you say? Yeah, they're going to grow up with the same traits. I'm still fishing for something else here. This is good, though. All right. Yes. How many times have you, and maybe this is true of you, maybe it was true of me, where you have this little child, and as they are growing up and maturing, and now they're in the teenage years, in the mind of the parent, they're still a little child because we want them to be a little child. We don't want to turn loose of the fact that they're losing their youth and now they're in the teenage years. So I've seen that, for example, when maybe here's a child that's 16, 17 years old, and the parent still treats them as a little child, and the child needs to obey the gospel, but I have had parents defend their child. They don't do anything wrong. They're still just a little child. No, they're not. They've grown up and matured and become a sinner now. They need the gospel. They need to obey the gospel now. Or the little girl that's wearing this little short dress at age 5 is not a big deal, but now she's 16 and mom thinks that she's just a little girl. But those boys who see her, they don't think that's a little girl. That's a woman in their eyes. Does that make sense? So realize that children grow up. Your child in the teenage years is not a little child anymore. Anything you want to add to that? That also applies to behavior in public. Sometimes the child is misbehaving and acting real childish. And maybe this child is 15 years old and is more acting like a 6 or 7 year old, and yet the parent tolerates it because they're just a little child. But the rest of us looking at that saying, you know what, that child should behave. That child is a teenager now. And so realize the age of your child. All right, here's something else, preparing for the teen years. Point E, be an example to your children. And we cite Ezekiel 16:44 as one of the texts. Children often turn out to be just like their parents. So since that's the case, the point of 1 Timothy 4 would be, or the application of 1 Timothy 4 would be what? Pretty simple. Whatever you want your child to be that yourself. I want my child to be a student of the Word, then be a student of the Word. I want my child to treat other people nice, then treat other people nice. I want my child to go to church all the time, then go to church all the time. I want my child to be, and you fill in the blank, then do that yourself. Because they often imitate what they have seen in their parents. All right, let's talk about developing communication. And I cite Ephesians 6. The word communication isn't found there. So why cite that? How does Ephesians 6 make this point? All right, very good. There is no way to fulfill Ephesians 6 without communicating. You're going to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? How do you do that without communicating? Don't provoke them to wrath. How am I knowing if I'm provoking them to wrath if there's not some communication? So I'll make the point in the workbook, and there's 2 points I want you to take note of. One is developing communication starts at an early age so that we can keep it going in the teenage years. So if I'm not communicating here in the young years, And now I've reached teenage years of my children, and now I need to start communicating. It ain't going to work. It ain't going to work. It just ain't going to work. It's going to fail. Guarantee it's going to fail. So start it young so that you can communicate with your children at age 6, at age 7, 8, 9, 10. Now when they're 16, 18, you still can communicate. Make sense? Absolutely. And secondly, communication involves two things. What are they? Listening and talking. Quite often some parents are only listeners and not talking at all. They're not telling their children what they need to hear. Others talk and they don't listen. You need to listen because you may learn something about what you need to talk about. So listen to your children. Listen to what their concerns are. Listen to what their complaints are. Listen. You may need to respond sternly, but listen to your children. That's an important part of communication. All right? Then here we go again. Point number G, commend and encourage. This is the last in that series there of that point. And if we do not provoke our children to wrath, as Ephesians 6 says, that means we're going to commend and encourage. So I go back to this rule. I said we'd see it again. This is why this fits here. Praise and commend your child and build self-confidence. That doesn't mean everything they do is just great. It's just great, it's great, 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 great. And no criticism at all, no correction at all. Obviously, we've dealt with correction and discipline, but commend where we can. Praise them for what they do that's good, based upon their age. For example, I gave the illustration of preaching. Obviously, at 13, I think I preached my first sermon, 15, no, it may have been 15, I'm not sure. Yeah, 15, I think it was. Preached my first sermon and full-time work at 17. All right? Obviously, at 15 and 17, I'm not what I was at 50. I understood that. I understand it now, but I didn't understand it then. But my parents praised me for what I was doing based on the age that I was. They knew I wasn't 50 years old. They knew I didn't have 35 years experience. Does that make sense? So your child does something and praise them based upon what they have, the abilities they have, based on their age and the experience they have. Make sense? Encourage them. Otherwise, you constantly criticize because I want to make them the best child they can be, so I'm going to find the fault so that I can make them better. You're going to destroy their self-confidence and they'll end up having no respect for you. How many times have you heard some child say or indicate that all they ever wanted in life was to please their parents and they're now 50, 60 years old and they still haven't done it? Have you seen that? I have. Some of you are nodding your head. You've dealt with that. And they still can't do anything to please their parents because their parents were constantly critical. All right, let's talk about challenges during the teenage years. One of the challenges, and we're on page 50 now, if you're following along, is the child obeying the gospel. Why is that a challenge? Absolutely. You want to encourage them to obey the gospel, but you don't want to force them to obey the gospel, and you don't want to encourage that too early. So here's some children will want to be baptized when they're not ready, and so you've got to discourage the time without discouraging their interest. Is that easy? No, it ain't easy. And the reason I know it's not easy is not only have I dealt with that as a parent, you bring your children to me to help you with that. And so it's not easy. You try to encourage without discouraging. Does that make sense? And so that's a difficult time for parents. And I don't want to discourage them. I don't want to push them away. And those are difficult times. So that's a challenge that you're going to face in teenagers that you may not have thought about right now when your child is 5, 6, or 7 years old. Make sense? All right, here's another challenge. Peer pressure and friends. What do we mean by that? Going with the wrong crowd. Exodus, there are 2 passages in Exodus where the Israelites followed the multitude to do evil. They followed the crowd. And so peer pressure is real. The Proverbs warn constantly, and we cite several of those here in Proverbs 1, Proverbs 12, about how friends can lead astray. Choose your friends carefully, because the wicked will lead them astray. Peer pressure and friends. So you're at a time where maybe at 5 years old, your biggest problem was a bad attitude of one of their friends. But now at 16 and 17, you're worried about drinking and drugs and premarital sex of their friends. And so that's a problem. You're worried about that. So you're worried about peer pressure. Here's something else. Dress, because now we've reached an age where the boys start paying attention to the girls and the girls start paying attention to boys. And if I'm in my mind thinking my kid is still just a kid, I may have a problem with immodesty. I want to mention that briefly because we deal with that thoroughly from time to time. Dating is another problem. Who they're going to date. I'm going to mention two things and then move on because I want to get to our questions at the end here and in the next couple of minutes. Start early. Start real early. You say, I've got a 4-year-old. Okay, great. Start early telling that child, when you grow up, you need to marry, do better than just marry a Christian. You need to marry somebody that fears God. There's a difference, I want to tell you. By Christian, I mean one who's been baptized and goes to church, member of the Church of Christ. I started early. I don't know what age we started telling our children, we want you to do more than marry a Christian. You need to marry someone who fears God. And then explain what that means. You'd be teaching your children that. It may pay off if you teach your children that. Yes, sir.
Real quick, kind of connect that back to the peer pressure of friends. I think that could apply with friends, they may have Christian friends they hang with, but they may be wearing that Christian name, only a name only. Maybe kind of the same thing, do they fear God? And you got to be careful with that, in that aspect too.
Good point. Good point. Briefly mention entertainment, dancing, and the prom. This is a time period, which, by the way, if you start early, teaching your children about morals, when they reach the teenage years, they won't be asking to go to the prom. There are numerous parents sitting here this morning whose children have never asked them, never thought of asking them, can I go to the prom? Why did those children not ask? They don't care about, no, because they started early teaching their children. And so you can do some teaching now, and your children won't be asking about the prom. They won't ask about the dance. It won't happen. It just won't happen if you do your job teaching your children. And then college. I want to mention this briefly and then go to our questions. What's the challenge of college? This is great. They may get a scholarship, and it's all paid for. What could be bad here? Send them off to college. Yes, ma'am. Okay, that's true. There's something else I want to focus on, though, for a minute, and here's the two things I want us to take note of. It's in the workbook. What are the children going to be taught at that school? If it's a school that is operated by the state, they may be taught and indoctrinated with evolution, et cetera, and destroy their faith. If it's a school operated by brethren, and I have my questions about that, and I don't mind telling you, that they may be taught by Christians who are looser, and they may have greater influence in tearing him astray than would that heathen professor who they know is an ungodly person. They have confidence in this godly professor, but he's loose, and they may be influenced in the wrong direction. Or, and another question I mentioned there, what's the church situation? They go off to college, maybe they've gone off to wherever to college, and there's not a sound church there, but it's a great college. What kind of church are they going to be attending for the next 4 years? Those are questions that need to be answered. I want to mention just briefly as we go and leave this, here's some questions that parents should ask themselves. We won't go through every one of these. Are we creating problems for the teenage years? Here's some situation I'm dealing with right now. Am I creating some problems for the teen years? Is that going on? Another question, I won't deal with every one of these. Have we given spiritual matters top priority? Down a little bit, what did successful parents do? And so I need to look around and say, here's somebody that did well with their children. What did they do in the teenage years? I might ask them what they did. And our last one is, are we keeping good communication going? Are we watching who they're with, et cetera? Make sense? Good comments. Appreciate your participation this morning.